Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, settle in, and just let the world outside fade away for a while. We're going to take a long, slow walk through a story that is as heavy as it is remarkable. You might know the name Solomon Northup from the movie or the book, but tonight we're going to spend some real time with him. We're going to look at the small details, the quiet moments, and the sheer, exhausting absurdity of a man who had everything taken from him because of a couple of guys in top hats and a very bad bottle of wine. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, and let's just drift back to 1841. Solomon Northup was, by all accounts, doing pretty well for himself. He lived in Saratoga Springs, New York, which even back then was the kind of place where people went to feel fancy and drink mineral water that tasted like pennies. He was a free man, a father, a husband, and a really gifted violinist. In the mid-19th century, being a good fiddle player was basically like being a rock star, but with more waistcoats and fewer pyrotechnics. He was smart, he was literate, and he had a reputation for being a hard worker. He did a bit of everything: farming, carpentry, even working on the Champlain Canal. He was the kind of guy who just figured things out. But his real passion was that violin. He could play anything, and in a resort town like Saratoga, that meant he was always in demand for parties and dances. Life was steady, it was predictable, it was safe. Or at least it should have been. One day in March, Solomon is just hanging around, probably thinking about his next gig, when he meets two men. They introduce themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. Now, looking back with the benefit of not being in 1841, these guys were clearly walking red flags. They claimed to be part of a circus company and said they needed a fast, talented fiddler to join them for a string of performances down in Washington, D.C. They offered him high wages, ridiculously high really, and promised to pay for his travel. They were charming, they were persuasive, and they had that specific kind of trust me, I'm a businessman energy that usually ends in a disappearing act. Solomon, thinking of the extra money for his family, decided to go. He didn't even tell his wife, Anne, because he figured he'd be back in a few weeks with a pocket full of cash and a few good stories. It was a classic what could possibly go wrong moment, and as we know, the answer was literally everything. They started traveling south. Solomon had his papers, documents proving he was a free man. He kept them tucked away, thinking they were his golden ticket back home. As they moved toward New York City and then toward D.C., Brown and Hamilton were the perfect companions. They were generous, they bought him dinner, they bought him drinks, and that's where things started to get a bit fuzzy. In Washington, the three of them were celebrating. There was a lot of wine, there was a lot of talk about the circus, but somewhere in the middle of all that conviviality, Solomon started to feel not great. His head began to throb. The room started to tilt in that way that usually means you've either had way too much to drink or someone has put something in your glass that definitely wasn't on the wine list. Hint, it was the latter. He eventually passed out in his hotel room, probably expecting to wake up with a mild headache and a craving for breakfast. Instead, he woke up in the dark. And it wasn't just a "I forgot to open the curtains" kind of dark. It was a cold, damp, underground kind of dark. He was in chains. His hands were bound, his feet were shackled, and the world he knew, the violin, the family in Saratoga, the cool New York air, was gone. He was in a slave pen, right in the shadow of the Capitol building. Because, nothing says land of the free like a human warehouse within walking distance of the seat of government. Solomon, being an intelligent and understandably terrified man, tried to explain the situation. He told the jailer, a man named James Birch, that he was a free man from New York. He explained about the circus guys, about his family, about his legal status. And this is where the sarcastic aside part of history kicks in. Birch didn't care. In fact, Birch found Solomon's insistence on his freedom to be an annoying technicality. To Birch, Solomon wasn't a man with a life and a violin. He was Platt, a nameless piece of property from Georgia. When Solomon kept insisting he was free, Birch decided that the best way to handle a legal dispute was with a wooden paddle and a cat of nine tails. The beating was brutal. It was designed to break not just the body, but the very idea of an identity. Birch told him that if he ever mentioned being a free man again, or if he ever mentioned his real name, he'd be killed. It's a very blunt way to conduct a business transaction, isn't it? Just beat the truth out of someone until they agree to a lie. So Solomon lay there in the dark, bleeding and confused, while the sounds of the city went on above him. The bells of the Capitol probably rang for sessions of Congress where men debated the future of the nation, while right underneath their feet, a man was being scrubbed of his humanity. Eventually, Solomon was bundled onto a boat called the Orleans. It was a ship destined for the Deep South, specifically New Orleans. This was the dreaded sold down the river scenario that every person of color in the North feared. On the boat, Solomon met others who had been snatched away from their lives. There was Eliza, a woman who had been promised her freedom from her master, who was also the father of her children, only to be sold away by her executors the moment he died. She had her 2 children with her, Randall and Emily. The atmosphere on the ship was a strange mix of salt air and absolute crushing despair. Solomon, ever the observer, watched the coast of the North fade away. He was moving into a world where the law didn't apply to him, or rather where the law was specifically designed to keep him in a cage. On the boat, there was a brief moment of hope. An outbreak of smallpox hit the crew and the cargo. Solomon actually helped nurse some of the people, and he even managed to get a letter written. He gave it to a sailor who seemed sympathetic, asking him to mail it to his friends in the North. It was a long shot, like throwing a message in a bottle into a hurricane, but it was all he had. For a moment, you can imagine him standing on the deck, watching the water, wondering if that little piece of paper would ever make it to the hands of someone who cared. But the boat kept moving south, deeper into the heat, deeper into the humidity, and further away from the man who played the violin in Saratoga. When they reached New Orleans, the market was ready. Solomon, now Platt, was put on display. This part of the story is always the most clinical and the most chilling. It was like a used car lot, but for souls. The buyers would come by, check the teeth, feel the muscles, ask about temperament. It's the kind of mundane evil that history is full of, men in nice suits making calculated investments in other people's misery. Eliza was there too, clutching her children. The heartbreak of that market was that the buyers usually didn't want the whole set. They wanted the strong man or the young woman or the healthy child. They didn't care about the family unit because in their ledgers, families didn't exist. Solomon was eventually bought by a man named William Ford. Now, Ford is an interesting character in Solomon's narrative. He describes him as a Christian man, kind and blinded by the culture he grew up in. It's a bit of a snarky irony, isn't it? A gentle slave owner. It's like saying someone is a gentle arsonist. Ford was a preacher and a planter on the Bayou Boeuf. He treated Solomon relatively well, considering the circumstances. He recognized Solomon's intelligence and his knack for problem-solving. At one point, he even helped Ford figure out a more efficient way to transport lumber by water, saving him a ton of money. For a little while, life was quiet. Not good, but quiet. Solomon worked hard, kept his head down, and tried to exist in this strange, humid limbo. He was still Platt, but he was a Platt who was useful. But in the world of the antebellum South, a slave's life was only as stable as their master's financials, and William Ford, for all his kindness and his preaching, was not very good with money. He fell into debt. And when a planter falls into debt, he starts selling off his assets, and Solomon was an asset. This led to Solomon being sold, or rather mortgaged, to a man named John M. Tibbets. If Ford was the kind master, Tibbets was the absolute opposite. He was a small, mean-spirited, insecure man who hated Solomon specifically because he was smarter than him. Tibbets was a carpenter, and Solomon was working under him. Every time Solomon showed a bit of competence or suggested a better way to do something, Tibbets took it as a personal insult. It's that classic dynamic where the person in power is terrified of the person they're supposed to be superior to. Tibbets was the kind of guy who would kick a dog just to prove he could, and Solomon was a very big, very capable dog who didn't look like he wanted to be kicked. Things eventually came to a head over something as simple as the size of some nails or the placement of a board. Tibbets tried to whip Solomon, but Solomon had finally had enough. In a moment that was both incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous, Solomon fought back. He didn't just defend himself, he overpowered Tibbets and gave him a taste of his own medicine. It was a brief, flickering moment of justice, but in the South of 1841, a slave hitting a white man was a death sentence. Tibbets, bruised and humiliated, left the plantation to gather a few friends and a rope. So there's Solomon, standing in the middle of a clearing, with a rope literally around his neck. Tibbets and his friends had done the deed. They'd strung him up. But they were interrupted by the plantation overseer, Chapin, before they could actually finish the job. Chapin, not necessarily out of the goodness of his heart, but more out of a respect for property laws, chased Tibbets off with a pair of pistols. Because, you see, Solomon was technically still mortgaged to William Ford, and you can't just go around destroying another man's collateral without a permit. But here is the truly sleepless historian part of the story, the kind of detail that makes you want to pull the covers up and sigh at the sheer absurdity of human cruelty. Chapin didn't take the rope off. Solomon spent the entire day, hours and hours in the sweltering Louisiana sun, standing on his tiptoes, the noose tightening every time his legs buckled. He watched the other slaves come and go from the fields. He watched the shadows grow long. He was a living lawn ornament of human misery, all because of a legal technicality. It wasn't until the sun was setting and Ford finally arrived that he was cut down. And what did Solomon do? He went back to work. Because in this world, survival isn't a dramatic montage. It's just a very long, very painful shift that never ends. Eventually, Tibbets decided he'd had enough of the unruly Solomon, and Solomon was sold to the man who would become the primary villain of his life, Edwin Epps. If Tibbets was a small-time bully, Epps was a professional. He was a slave breaker, a man who viewed himself as a master of men, but was really just a functioning alcoholic with a whip and a very fragile ego. Epps's plantation was on the Bayou Boeuf, a place where the humidity is so thick you can basically chew it, and the mosquitoes are the size of small birds. This became Solomon's home for the next 10 years. Imagine that. 10 years of picking cotton. Now, Solomon wasn't great at picking cotton. It's a specific skill. You need nimble fingers and a certain kind of mindless endurance. Solomon was too thoughtful, too observant. He was constantly being whipped because he couldn't hit his quota at the end of the day. Epps, meanwhile, would get drunk and decide it was time for a dancing party, which meant forcing the exhausted slaves to dance in the middle of the night while Solomon played his violin. It's a bizarre, dark image, the beautiful music of the fiddle floating through the swamp, accompanied by the smell of cheap whiskey and the sound of Epps's heavy boots. But the real heart of the darkness on the Epps plantation wasn't Solomon. It was a young woman named Patsy. If Solomon's story is a tragedy, Patsy's is a nightmare. She was the best cotton picker on the plantation. She could pick 500 pounds a day, which is an insane amount of labor. Because she was so productive, she was Epps's favorite, but in the worst possible way. He obsessed over her, which led to his wife, Mary Epps, hating her with a cold, calculated fury. Patsy was caught in a pincer movement of abuse, the husband's unwanted affection and the wife's very wanted cruelty. Solomon had to watch this play out day after day. He describes Patsy as a woman who just wanted to die, who once begged him to kill her just to make the cycle stop. But they kept going, they kept picking, and Solomon kept thinking. He never stopped being a New Yorker. He never stopped being a literate man. He spent his nights in the slave quarters mentally drafting letters, memorizing the geography of the Bayou Boeuf, and looking for a crack in the wall. One year, a caterpillar infestation destroyed the cotton crop. You'd think this would be a break, but no. Epps just leased his slaves out to work on a sugar plantation. This gave Solomon a change of scenery and a chance to make a little money on the side, playing the violin at local parties. He actually managed to save a few coins, which he hid away like a squirrel preparing for a very unlikely winter. During this time, Solomon tried to trust a white man, a wandering carpenter named Armsby. Solomon gave him the money he'd saved and asked him to mail a letter to Saratoga. Armsby promised he would. And then, because why not add a little betrayal to the mix, Armsby immediately went to Epps and told him everything. Epps confronted Solomon, and this is where Solomon's quick thinking saved his life. He didn't deny it, he turned it back on Armsby. He laughed and told Epps that Armsby was just trying to get into Epps's good graces by making up lies. He convinced Epps that a stupid slave like himself couldn't possibly write a letter. Epps, being a classic narcissist who believed his own hype about racial superiority, actually fell for it. He figured Solomon was too simple to be a secret pen pal. So, Solomon stayed. He picked more cotton, he played more fiddle, he watched Patsy suffer, and he waited. He waited for 10 years. Think about that for a second. 10 years is 3,650 days. It's a lot of cotton. It's a lot of heat. Most people would have broken. Most people would have forgotten the sound of their own real name. But Solomon Northup was holding on to his identity like a life raft in the middle of an ocean of mud. Then, in 1852, a man named Bass arrived. He was a Canadian carpenter, and he was different. He was outspoken. He openly argued with Epps about the morality of slavery, which was a very bold move in rural Louisiana. Solomon listened. He watched. He saw a man who actually had a conscience, which in the Bayou Boeuf was about as rare as a snowstorm. One day, Solomon took the ultimate risk. He approached Bass while they were working on a new building. He didn't start with a plea. He started with a conversation. He tested the waters. And finally, he told him, "I am a free man. My name is Solomon Northup. I was kidnapped from Saratoga Springs." Bass didn't laugh. He didn't go to Epps. He looked at Solomon, and for the first time in over a decade, Solomon saw himself reflected in the eyes of someone who saw a human being instead of a plat. Bass agreed to write the letters. He wrote to Solomon's friends in the north, detailing exactly where Solomon was and who was holding him. And then they waited. Again, the agonizing wait for a reply from a world that had seemingly moved on without him. Solomon went back to the fields, back to the whip, back to the dancing parties, wondering if Bass had actually sent the letters or if this was just another Armsby situation. But this time, the letter didn't get lost. It landed in the hands of Henry B. Northup, a lawyer and a relative of the family that had originally manumitted Solomon's father. Henry was a man of action. He took the letter to the governor of New York. He gathered affidavits. He secured legal authority to go down to Louisiana and claim a New York citizen who was being held in illegal bondage. The rescue wasn't like a movie. There were no explosions or high-speed carriage chases. It was a lawyer with a folder full of papers. Henry Northup traveled to Louisiana, met with a local sheriff, and they headed out to the Epps plantation. When they arrived, Epps was, predictably, furious. He felt like he was being robbed of his property. He didn't care about the law or the kidnapping. He cared about his investment. Solomon saw the carriage approaching. He saw the white men in their fine northern coats. He saw Henry Northup, a man he hadn't seen in 12 years. And in that moment, the name Platt died. But before Solomon could leave, there was one final heartbreaking moment. He had to say goodbye to Patsy. He couldn't take her with him. The law that was saving him didn't apply to her. She was legally property, and he was legally free. As the carriage pulled away, Solomon looked back and saw her standing there, a broken figure in the dust of the plantation, while he moved toward a life she would never know. So Solomon is in the carriage. He's leaving the Bayou Boeuf behind, watching the moss-draped cypress trees and the endless shimmering heat waves of the plantation retreat into the distance. It's a strange thing, isn't it? To spend 12 years in a place that tried to systematically erase your soul, and then just drive away in a carriage with a man in a clean suit. He wasn't Platts anymore. He was Solomon Northup again. But he was a Solomon Northup who had seen things that the people back in Saratoga Springs couldn't even fathom in their worst nightmares. He was free. But freedom has a way of feeling very heavy when you're carrying a decade of trauma in your pockets. The journey back north was a long, slow blur of rattling trains and churning steamships. Every mile he traveled was a mile further from the whip, but the transition wasn't exactly a Hollywood ending. He had to navigate a world that had moved on without him. When he finally reached New York in early 1853, the reunion with his family was, as you can imagine, pretty intense. Imagine walking up to your own front door after 12 years of being presumed dead. His wife, Anne, had raised their children alone, working as a cook to keep the family afloat, never knowing if her husband was dead or if he'd simply abandoned them. His children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo, were grown. Little Alonzo, who had been just a toddler when Solomon disappeared, was now a man. It's one of those moments that's so sweet it almost hurts because while he got his life back, he could never get those 12 years of fatherhood back. He'd missed the birthdays, the first steps, the quiet evenings by the fire. Those years were just gone, eaten by the cotton fields and the humid indifference of the South. He even had a grandson he'd never met, named Solomon, a new life starting while he was still trying to piece his old one back together. But Solomon wasn't the type to just sit on his porch, drink some tea, and try to forget. He was a man of the North, a man of law and letters, and he wanted justice. He wanted to look the men who stole his life in the eye and see them pay for it. And this is where the story takes a turn into the deeply frustrating world of 19th century bureaucracy. He went after the men who had kidnapped him. Remember our circus friends, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton? Well, it turns out their real names were Alexander Merrill and Joseph Russell. They were actually small-time grifters from New York. Solomon and his legal team tracked them down, and there was a high-profile trial in Washington, D.C. It should have been a slam dunk, right? We have the victim, we have the kidnappers, we have the bills of sale. But here's the sarcastic aside from Lady Justice herself. Because of the laws in D.C. at the time, Solomon, as a black man, was not allowed to testify against white men in court. Think about the sheer, dizzying absurdity of that for a second. He was the only witness to his own kidnapping. He was the only person who could tell the jury exactly what happened in that dark hotel room, how the wine tasted, and how the chains felt. But the law basically told him to stay quiet and sit in the corner while the adults talked about his life as if it were a property dispute over a stray cow. Because Solomon couldn't testify, the case against the kidnappers fell apart. They walked free. They probably walked right out of that courtroom, adjusted their top hats, and went looking for the next talented musician to exploit. It was a legal slap in the face that proved that while Solomon was free, the system was still very much rigged. Since he couldn't get justice in a courtroom, he decided to get it on the page. He was a smart guy. He knew that if he couldn't win in D.C., he could win in the court of public opinion. He teamed up with a writer named David Wilson to produce his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. Now, usually ghost-written memoirs from the 1800s are a bit dry, but Solomon's story was different. It was visceral. It was clinical in its detail. He didn't just talk about the beatings, he talked about the economics of the plantation, the biology of the cotton plant, and the psychological warfare of the overseers. The book was published in 1853, and it was an absolute bombshell. It sold 30,000 copies in the first few months, which back then was the 19th century equivalent of breaking the internet. Solomon became a celebrity of the abolitionist movement. He traveled around the North giving lectures, standing on stages in drafty town halls, telling his story over and over again. He was a living, breathing piece of evidence against the peculiar institution. He advocated for the millions who were still stuck where he had been, people like Patsy who didn't have a New York lawyer or a Canadian carpenter to come and rescue them. He spent his days retelling his trauma so that others might not have to live it. It must have been exhausting. Every night he'd go to bed and probably still hear the sound of Epps' whip or the hum of the bayou mosquitoes. But then, around 1857, the story starts to get quiet. The trail doesn't just go cold, it disappears into a thick mist. By the late 1850s, Solomon Northup, one of the most famous and documented men in the country, just vanishes from the public record. One minute he's giving a speech in Canada, and the next he's a ghost. There are plenty of theories, of course, because humans hate a mystery. Some people think he joined the Underground Railroad and went into deep hiding to help others escape, which would be a poetic full circle moment. Others have a darker theory that he might have been kidnapped again. I mean, can you imagine? That would be a level of bad luck that's almost statistically impossible. But then again, look at his first 40 years of life. There were rumors he'd been spotted in various places, but nothing stuck. No death certificate has ever been found. No grave marked Solomon Northup exists in any cemetery in Saratoga or beyond. Even his family seemed to lose track of him in the end. His wife, Anne, died in 1876, and her obituary described her as a widow, but it didn't say when or where Solomon had passed. For a man who fought so incredibly hard to reclaim his name and his identity, a man who refused to be Platt, it's a haunting irony that history doesn't know where he ended up. He spent 12 years being a lost man, and then he chose to get lost on his own terms. He drifted off into the fog of time, leaving behind a book, a violin, and a legacy that wouldn't be fully appreciated for another 150 years. Maybe he just wanted peace. Maybe he wanted to go somewhere where nobody knew him as the kidnapped man or the slave who escaped. Maybe he just wanted to be a man with a violin, playing a tune for himself in a place where the sun wasn't quite so hot and the laws were a bit more just. So, as you drift off tonight, think about Solomon. Think about the man who played the fiddle in the middle of a swamp, who survived the noose and the whip, and who never forgot the sound of his own name, even when the world tried its best to drown it out. It's a heavy story, yeah. It's got some jagged edges, but it's also a story about the weird, stubborn, quiet endurance of the human spirit. The lights are low now. The bayou is 1,000 miles away. The sound of the violin has faded into the night air. Just breathe. Let the history settle into the floorboards and rest. You've traveled a long way with Solomon tonight. It's okay to let go now. Subscribe if you love this kind of immersive historical storytelling. It's not just facts, it's feelings. Drop your current city and time in the comments. I love knowing who's sailing the night seas with me.